efforts. Those efforts actually date from the 1960s, and specifically 1965. And they start with Lyndon Johnson. As you can tell, Lyndon Johnson actually had a great deal to do with how affirmative action developed. And this is really where affirmative action per se begins. In 1965, President Johnson issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination among federal employees. In addition, he set up an Office of Federal Contract Compliance, and he provided that a certain percentage of all federal contracts had to be given to minority employers, minority-owned businesses. When President Johnson introduced the concept of affirmative action, he explained it this way. He said, wait, let's say you have two people, and they're supposed to run a race. And you have them at the starting line. One person has a 300-ton weight on his ankle. And you run that race over and over again for about 300 years. And then finally you remove the weight from the ankle of the one person, and you say, well, now you could run. Well, if any of you has had anything happen to an ankle or a leg and you're immobile for a week, for 2 weeks, a month, you don't immediately jump up and start running a race. So he said, because we have shackled African Americans in particular from the beginning of this country, it is necessary to do some affirmative things in order to bring them up to speed. In other words, if you just say now the race can start, you ignore the fact of what has happened for 300 years. So that's why he says, whoops. That's where the expression comes from. Some affirmative, positive action has to be taken in order to level the playing field, in order that both of these races, both of these runners, can actually be in the same position. If you don't, then you simply perpetuate what has already been. That's what affirmative action is supposed to do. And that's what he intended it for it to do. Followed by President Johnson. You have President Nixon, a Republican. Everyone knows President Nixon was a very conservative Republican. President Nixon in 1969 established the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. And he actually provided for set-asides. He set aside $100 million to be invested in minority-owned businesses. $100 million. This is Richard Nixon. Now, what I should mention in talking about affirmative action and affirmative action efforts is that in order to sell the idea, to get congressional support, those who would profit from affirmative action had to be expanded beyond the African Americans who had been enslaved, just as a political matter. So that affirmative action has always referred to women and to other racial minorities, certainly Native Americans, to certain Hispanic groups, Asian groups. They have always been a part of the groups to be protected by affirmative action, always. It has never simply been for African Americans. And even though those 3 Civil War amendments that I mentioned to you, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, even though each one of those was drafted and adopted with a view towards addressing the prior slave condition of Africans and African Americans, the fact of the matter is that the language does not simply speak in racial terms. So that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applies to everyone. As I mentioned, indeed, it has even been applied to corporations. That's how far it has been extended. Okay. Well, that takes us through the third part, and that is federal affirmative action efforts. And now I'm to the last part, and that is the United States Supreme Court and affirmative